In today's upcoming programme, we're going to be taking a look at a cancelled dinosaur film that Kong took many elements from, how animals were almost harmed during the making of King Kong, and finally, we lay a nearly 100-year-old mystery to rest on what exactly did happen to the Spider Pit sequence, and as well clearing up some of the biggest misconceptions surrounding this infamous scene. And remember, if this sounds like your cup of tea and you want to see more like it, then don't forget to subscribe, as it's always humbly appreciated. Before we begin things off, I just want to give a special thank you to Kyle Bird, who aided as the consultant during the making of this video. Be sure to check out Kaiju Mission Podcast if you're into monster flicks. Also, a special shout out to Sketchflux and Seeker of the Lost, in additionally aiding as behind the scenes support. King Kong was the brainchild of Merian C. Cooper, where him and his business partner Ernest Shozak had a previous lifestyle on equivalent to Indiana Jones. When they were in the movie business together, they would go off to exotic places to create their flicks. Ernest Shozak would eventually marry off a lady, Ruth Rose, and she would aid for the scripting for the double act team. By the 30s, with jungle movies proven to be quite popular, the trio was slowly developing an idea where a crew explore an exotic isolated land and encounter some mythical animals, more specifically centering around gorillas. The biggest inspiration for Merian C. Cooper's Ape movie was the 1926 expedition by W. Douglas Burden to seek out the Komodo dragons, capturing 3 living specimens, giving 2 of them to the New York Bronx Zoo, although they unfortunately passed away not too long afterwards. Gorillas and Komodo dragons were only relatively newly known within the Western world of science. Mountain gorillas were discovered as recently as 1902, 31 years before the release of King Kong, and the first European sightings of Komodo dragons was in 1910, 23 years before Kong, just barely shy of a generation earlier. Furthermore, these 2 species were mainly exclusive to the wild, and very few zoos had them in captivity, so to feature them in a movie would have given it an extra slice of something special. Cooper's idea was to travel to Africa to capture some gorillas, and would have brought them to the Komodo Islands. They would have constructed miniature sets, and filming both gorillas and Komodo dragons fighting amongst one another. But his pitch for the movie was a hard sell, as filming a feature-length movie outside of Hollywood would have been immensely expensive for the time. That, and let's be honest, the ethics of having 2 animals forcing to fight one another for the entertainment of a film, we probably wouldn't reflect back on King Kong as fondly. When he came to RKO in December of 1931 to try and sell his movie, he caught wind of a very expensive project that was having quite a number of development issues. At the age of 29, Willis O'Brien was working in a sculptural studio for the exhibit of San Francisco. Him and his work pal colleague were playing and manipulating the sculptures. However, Obi wondered that by using the technology of photography, if he could capture these sculptures moving. During that same year, he created his first stop-motion short film, titled The Dinosaur and the Missing Link. O'Brien wasn't exactly the man who invented stop motion, but he was the first American filmmaker to really push and expand the medium, such as gradually trying to apply realism into the animation, and to make the dinosaurs more authentic to life. It was helped that he was a sculptor in anatomy. The exhibitor got to see the work in progress and funded it to be featured for the display. This exposure got him notoriety, and he was hired on to the Edison Company to make a series of short films about long extinct animals. Eventually, O'Brien would collaborate with the animator Herbert M. Dawley to make the 1918 short film The Ghost of Slumber Mountain, the earliest known movie to combine both live-action humans and stop-motion dinosaurs. Dawley and O'Brien both played small parts in the film, with O'Brien playing the role of Mad Dick the Ghost, about stumbling upon a contraption where, when you look look through it, you can see back in time. This film was initially 40 minutes upon its premiere, but sadly it was cut down to 12 minutes for its wide distribution, and for years it was presumed that that was the only version that had survived. Within the 2010s, the film was just restored to shy of 20 minutes. So at least half of the movie still exists today. For years, it was presumed that Dawley backstabbed Willis O'Brien, as he removed his name from the surviving prints of the movie and was the one that was responsible for heavily cutting it down, and was just written off as a greedy businessman who contributed very little work to the actual film, essentially stealing all the credit from Willis O'Brien. Although only after some recent unearthing of information, that it's fair to say that both men were just as creatively collaborative with the animation, and that O'Brien wasn't perhaps too innocent himself in the circumstances that led up to his removal. After this production, both men parted ways. Dawley created a short film follow-up called Along the Moonbeam Trail that had thought to be a long-lost film and had only resurfaced by the early 2020s, 100 years after its release. O'Brien would format together a small team and they would do commission work for stop-motion projects. His most well-known piece of work during the silent era of movies was the 1925 Lost World adaptation, perhaps the real first blockbuster movie to utilise stop-motion animation to be widely used as a visual effect. Writer and director of The Lost World, Harry Hoyt, would collaborate with O'Brien several years later to make a follow-up spiritual successor, this time in sound. The film would be given the title Creation. It would have been about passengers on a cruise ship crashing on a remote island filled to the brim of prehistoric animals, and a lost structure of an ancient civilization housing some gems and treasure. Splice in there a family drama about a bride preferring to be with another man over her fiancé, and you've got yourself a classic Hollywood story. The studio had already invested about $100,000 into the film, with about 20 minutes worth of film footage being assembled, which already an expensive film during the early 30s would have cost about $200,000. So if Creation would have been fully filmed, the final estimated cost it would have taken to produce was $1 million. At the peak of the Great Depression in America, RKO couldn't rationalise that the film would recoup its cost. That and high authority figure Merian C. Cooper didn't find the story ever so engaging, so he convinced the executives to can the production of Creation and allocated the resources to his pet project given the working title The Beast, before being renamed King Kong. As a more practical way to make the monsters of the film, he felt that Willis O'Brien and his team had a marvellous method to bring to life his giant lizards and gorilla. To make the most of the assets that had already been produced, the Komodo dragons would instead be the prehistoric monsters that were pre-made for Creation. And some action scenes did semi-get to make it for King Kong. The most prominent out of all of them is the log bridge scene. From the third of the story that was filmed, only about 4 minutes of the material still exist. It was included as a bonus feature on the 2-disc DVD set of King Kong released in 2005, with a provided commentary by Ray Harryhausen.
This, of course, would tug on your heartstrings to see this man shooting this baby dinosaur. Oh, he's shooting them in the eye. Ah, the villain.
It additionally featured a 14-minute recreation of Creation, utilising the surviving conceptual artwork to illustrate the main story beats of the plot. In 2016, Bonham's auctioneer had placed up incredibly rare photograph stills of King Kong, as well as some never-before-seen photographs from Creation, which had not been featured in any previous publications before. The images may very well illustrate some of the now long-lost footage. Unfortunately, taking photographs was prohibited during the event, and while some have materialised online in varying quality, some have still yet to have reappeared. To give some anticipation for the King Kong movie, a novelisation was created of the film and released just a few months prior. Fascinatingly, there are some interesting scenes that are only exclusive in the book that were not featured in the film. And that's because the book was based on an earlier version of the story. "5 years later, King Kong would become one of the earliest Hollywood movies to garner a re-release. However, by this point the Hays Code was in full effect of the industry, essentially being a regulated system to make sure film studios weren't producing movies that were deemed to be unreserved. This was to combat politics and women's rights movements that were pressurizing film studios to be more sophisticated. Unfortunately, that meant for Kong's reissuing, there were some scenes that were deemed to be too inappropriate by the Hays office. The following shots that were cut out were close-ups of the Brontosaurus chewing down the sailors. Then you've got the very suggestive scene where King Kong is ripping off Anne's clothing, and he's smelling the material as he goes on. Yeah. They as well removed the shot of Kong stepping on one of the natives and chewing another. As well, Kong doesn't become any more innocent for when he starts rampaging around New York. The scene of Kong chewing up a pedestrian, then he finds a lady in a bedroom. Thinking that it's Anne, once he realises that it's not, he just simply chucks her to the ground. What a fine gentleman. RKO didn't hold on to their original theatrical print of the film. So, for over 30 years, these scenes were thought to be long lost. Until by the late 60s, a 16mm print of the original cut of Kong was rediscovered in Philadelphia. To commemorate its rediscovery, the film got a re-release in 1969. So if you weren't too amazed by Kong's recent adventures made by Toho, which would have just reached America a year prior, then you had a special treat of seeing the original unaltered version of Kong. As advertised on the poster, the uncut version never seen on TV. Although unfortunately the surviving censor shots were only preserved on 16mm film, which just paled in comparison for when they were spliced in the still existing 35mm prints. For several decades, this would be the most complete version available to watch. That was until it was rediscovered that in England there were several nitrate prints of the original version of Kong that were uncensored. Thus now the original censor clips existed on a higher quality format that could be rescanned and used for any desirable digital quality. The biggest contributing reason as to why the censor clips have survived was that the prints were mass produced all across the world and had a chance to flee before they were destroyed internally by the studio. Although footage that wasn't as fortunate to survive from King Kong were the many deleted scenes, where since they were never given a chance to be mass produced across the world, the only known film copies there would have been retained within the studio. The company has checked and it appears that within the span of 90 plus years, that not a roll of film have survived today. Perhaps to make the most of the unused assets from creation, an additional monster fight was going to be in the picture, with Kong fighting off a mother Triceratops next to a tar pit. The sequence was partially complete before it was removed out. The Triceratops were one of the very few animals/dinosaurs that didn't get reused in either King Kong or Son of Kong, which is quite astonishing since there were so many duplicates of Triceratops that were made for creation. Another animal that didn't get the luxury to appear in either film was a distant ancestry cousin to the rhino, Arsniriferium. The animation puppet very nearly did end up in the original Kong. He was meant to chase the sailors on the log bridge, but the men end up on the middle of the bridge when Kong comes up to the other side, with both ends leading to big beasties. The men are essentially trapped in the middle with nowhere else to go. However, at some point, it was decided to redo the animation with a dinosaur instead, being a Styracosaurus. However, the material ended up getting cut out for the final print. Although there is one shot that's retained in the film where the sailors are looking back during the sequence where the Styracosaurus would have been. Although now it mutually creates this plot inconvenience, where their only obstacle is the massive gorilla on one side, although don't make an attempt to escape on the other side of the log bridge. Maybe in that moment they were too stunned to move. Unfortunately for them, the only place that was left to go was down. The Arsniriferium ever so nearly did get a reprisal for a Kong remake, as it was idealised to be featured in Universal's The Legend of King Kong, although the movie itself never materialised. There was a scene where we would have seen Kong climbing over the mountains into his cave, although a reason as to why this may have been cut out was that Kong's face had somewhat dishevelled in the hot studio lights, thus Kong's look was off-modelled and may have disrupted the continuity from the rest of the film. It's believed that there was an extended scene of Jack and Anne escaping from Kong, featuring additional material of the giant ape climbing down after them, although this was removed for pacing reasons. In the New York Rampage scene, we would have seen Kong breaking up a hotel poker party. A similar scene to this as well happened in the 1925 Lost World. Originally, as King Kong escaped, he would have climbed on the hotel rooftop and would have been followed by police fog lights. There is still a small bit of dialogue retained in the final cut indicating this lost scene.
What do we do? Firefighter searchlight. Get him up on the roof. Yeah, that'll keep him in sight.
This tram scene ended up replacing the fog light scene for the final cut. What would have been the second to final shot with Kong was where we would have seen a sky-high view of Kong falling to his death. It was a very dynamic and ambitious shot for its time, although the final composite wasn't quite as pleasing as the producers were hoping for, as Kong was semi-transparent in the shot, thus it was deemed unusable. It's roughly estimated between 20 to 25 minutes of footage was removed out, which would have made the final print well over 2 hours long. Within the span of nearly 100 years, there's been no official leads or sightings of any print of the pre-release version. According to Merian C. Cooper, he was very much under the impression that the deleted scenes were destroyed in a fire at RKO during the 1950s. Preserving unused assets wasn't yet a common practice within Hollywood. Examples of deleted scenes and alternative cuts to films that have survived for 90 plus years have been few and far in between. Their lucky survival have happened in the most rarest of circumstances. The chances of today finding an unspoiled film copy of King Kong that's still playable is fairly unlucky, unfortunately. The older the missing media is, the far less avenues there are to go down to for any additional copies to still find. However, before we close the chapter on the 33 Kong, there's still one final deleted sequence that's worth talking about. And I've saved it to last because this one has got quite the legacy. The most famous and well-known deleted scene of the film has gone down through the decades as one of the most desired pieces of missing media, frequently dubbed the nickname as the Spider Pit sequence. Set just after Kong throws the remaining sailors down the ravine, the crew who were lucky enough to survive the fall would be in for a much worse death, as the creatures from the dark would emerge out to finish them off. Allegedly, according to film legend, when this sequence was previewed in a test screening, the audience were aghast at what they saw, and that's putting it calmly without going into sensational rumours. According in a rediscovered letter by Merian C. Cooper, that he felt that the short sequence had spoiled the film's pacing. Furthermore, King Kong has often been attributed as the first monster movie to have an original starring creature, so perhaps having giant creepy crawlies that hadn't previously been seen in movies before maybe would have left an overcasting shadow over Kong's. In other words, the scene was a bit too unique for its own good, and could have easily been its own movie, while apparently the clip hasn't been seen not since the 1930s. Even just going by the description, it's a very dark moment, which only helped to aid it to fuel the morbid imagination on how it may have looked, which some of the most famous lost media topics always seem to centre around really dark and morbid stuff. The sailors' grisly demise by the spider creatures was retained for the film's novelisation, with the inaccessibility of widespread behind-the-scenes knowledge of films of the time. The devoted followers to the Kong films were rather puzzled if this exclusive scene in the Book of the Spiders was ever intended to be in the 33 film. It wouldn't be until about 41 years later that in the famous Monsters of Filmland issue King Kong special that it featured the first public look on what the sequence may have looked like. The photograph was contributed by Delgado, where him and his brother worked on the original production, and with the censor clips being re-edited back into the film some years earlier, fans were hopeful that the Spider Pit sequence may still exist. There was much speculation and rumours as to where the footage may be without any basis in fact. Well over 5 decades on, the film material has yet to resurface. There are only a handful of photographs from the Spider Pit sequence, and they unfortunately don't provide a terribly great look at the creatures. But let's break down to see what original glimpses we do have. There are about 5 creatures in total. The one that we have the best reference material for is the Vine Crawler, which was the only one to make it for the final cut. You can see them climbing up towards Jack Driscoll, just about roughly after where the deleted sequence would have been placed in the film, and the arms, neck and head of the creature does still exist. The next creature that we have the best reference material for is the main spider. We have 2 very clear photographs of the creature, so crisp that you can just make out some of the finer detail, such as the hairs on the back. Some of the other stop motion models from Kong got to be used as scene decorations in other RKO pictures, like the 1946 movie A Genius at Work. But it's the 1940 movie you'll find out that provides us our best look at the spider. It's in this shot right here that we can see our 8-legged hairy friend. And with a torch aimed directly at him, we can see that this chap has 2 beady little eyes, a point of detail that was completely obstructed in the prior pictures. Our third creature is a massive iguana-looking lizard, this one being the clearest surviving photograph that the creature appears in, where we get a fair look at its face. We can also see a full body shot of the iguana within one of several photographs of the same angle, likely being part of a mock-up exposure test of the sequence. Within the series of photographs, we can see the sailors being approached by a rather big and nasty creepy crawly. This being our 4th monster, originally conceptualized to be a crab creature, although it was reduced to look more spider-like for the final intended shoot. Unfortunately, in the surviving photographs, we only have a backside view of the creature. Going back to that shot in the film, you'll find out, we can see a better form of the body. You can see that crab-like inspiration with its crustacean back. And the 5th and final monster is a tentacle/plant creature. Sadly, there are no known photographs of the Freakazoid. Outside of conceptual sketches, we don't know how it would have appeared on screen, making it certainly the most elusive out of all 5 creatures. Well, in saying that, there is an interesting thing on one of the Polaroid shots. This may very well be the tentacle creature, maybe just one of the other beasties of the pit, or it could very well just be one of the sailors. The shape is just too indistinguishable to really make out. In 1957, O'Brien was attached to another black and white creature feature, Black Scorpion, featuring many large creepy crawlies. In 1998, Steve Archer publicised a book about O'Brien, and stated that the creatures that were used in Black Scorpion were recycled from the Spider Pit scene of King Kong, and within the last 20 years has been mostly accepted as fact within the monster-loving community. However, Steve Archer's book was the only source for this fact. There are about 3 main creatures that appear in Black Scorpion, and lining them out with the 5 that we do know that appeared in King Kong, none of them truly match up. We know that there was no scorpion or hard-shell worm that appeared in the proposed sequence. However, the spider does seem the most compelling. We are aware that there was meant to be 2 spider-like creatures in King Kong, and the existing stop-motion spider model from Black Scorpion has often been labelled as appearing in the 33 Classic. Although, lining the spider up with the existing material from King Kong, they're not exactly identical. They both have different formations of the body. The one that appears in Black Scorpion has 8 limbs, but 6 of them act as the legs, and the 2 of the front act as appendages, having a stance that's a bit more crab-like, where the one from King Kong, from what we can see, has a stance more conventional of a spider with all 8 limbs acting as legs. And while sadly we don't have a direct clear look of the second spider, from what we can roughly make out, this one appears to have about 6 legs, and having a crustacean back, which the one of Black Scorpion doesn't appear to have. In 2020, the Lost Film fanzine Issue 3 did an article looking into the probability if the models from Kong would have been reused for Black Scorpion, with visual effects artists Ernest Fiorenzo and Mark Wolf aiding as consultants on the piece. They point out on how the Scorpion movie was made by Warner Brothers and not RKO, which they would have retained the Kong puppets at this time, and without a pay of rental they wouldn't have just simply handed them over. Furthermore, the movie was made 24 years after King Kong, and with the gradual and natural deterioration of the material that the puppets would have been made out of, they most certainly wouldn't be within any usable condition by this time. And assessing the surviving Black Scorpion models, the material and the way they were built are completely different to that of the creatures of Kong, adding further credibility that these puppets were made in a completely different setting. So it's safe to say that these creepy crawlies weren't the same ones that were going to appear in Kong. In 1975, Universal were in the midst of pre-production of a Kong remake, titled The Legend of King Kong. It had visual effect artist Jim Danforth of When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth fame to manage the visual effects for the movie. In one of the widely available conceptual artworks of the film, we can see that a giant fearsome millipede was proposed to be in the film. It's been speculated that the centipede would have been in a re-rendition of the Spider Pit sequence for this adaptation, although at the time of recording there are a lot of finer details that are not widely publicly known about the plot, so the legend of King Kong is still mostly ambiguous. But one thing we definitely do know for certain 100% was that the movie was never made. Via a complicated courtroom case, the rights to remake Kong went over to Paramount Pictures, which they produced and released their rendition by late 1976. Although the movie would go without its own interpretation of the Spider Pit sequence, it wouldn't be until 72 years after the original that a King Kong movie, being the Peter Jackson remake, featured a Spider Pit scene. However, by the early 2020s, some new light has been shed on the Spider Pit sequence, thanks to the intense research by film historian Ray Moulton, who's looked over a lot of the original paperwork and documents for the making of Kong, and had came to notice something quite peculiar about the test screening with the Spider Pit sequence inserted. It had never happened. He couldn't find any dates, he couldn't find any audience feedback. It's more or less a story on how horrified the audience were, decades after it allegedly happened, all coming from Merian C. Cooper. Furthermore, he found very little of the scheduled plans for filming the King Kong scenes that didn't end up in the final cut. There are documentations of scenes that did wound up in the final film, but it doesn't appear that all the deleted scenes had a set date, including the Spider Pit sequence, concluding that it very well may have never even been filmed. The sets and models were built for the sequence and some test filming was even underway, but for reasons of course, since King Kong was a very expensive film, Merian C. Cooper had to go through the script and remove scenes that he felt didn't enhance the story, to save money on not filming the unnecessary stuff. So years later, when his letter was found about why it was cut because it stopped the story, he essentially removed it during the scripting process. So the reality is, we probably are never going to find this Spider Pit sequence, simply because it was never filmed to begin with.
I don't know why he told that story about having it in a preview, except I think in his mind
it could have been entirely memory. I mean,
yeah. My thought is I think he was really excited about the sequence, and I think he was disappointed it wasn't in there.
And Cooper saying that it was simply too terrifying for the audience? Well, the thing is, Cooper could sometimes be a bit of a showman who enjoyed making his stories a little bit more dramatic.
But Cooper tells a lot of stories. Like, right. He told a story about the way where he got the idea for the Empire State Building ending was he looked up and he saw a biplane flying by the Empire State Building, and he imagined a giant gorilla up there, and that's where the idea for Kong. And you will see that repeated all over it. That is not where the idea came from. The biplanes weren't even in the script till like the 5th draft of the screenplay. So Cooper, he's a storyteller. He made up stories,
Sadly, by the time that the Spider Pit sequence came to wider attention, both Cooper and O'Brien were long gone, so they couldn't add any clarification about the whole situation. Thus, it was believed that the unmade deleted scene had once existed for many years to come, making it the greatest lost media hoax. Anyway, by the time that we finally did get a Spider Pit sequence that was fully filmed, that there was some attempts to reimagine how it may have looked like in the 30s. The most well-known attempt to recreate the sequence was in 2005, where Peter Jackson and his visual effects team made a very ambitious approximation as to what they think the Spider Pit sequence may have looked like, still utilising stop motion to bring to life many of the Skull Island animals. Additionally collaborating with 2 other filmmakers, Frank Darabont and Rick Baker, breaking down the content of the original script. They additionally recreate the missing shots with the Styracosaurus, faithfully replicating the original stop motion model, which Peter Jackson just so happens to have in his Kong collection. Unlike the previous attempt, they did utilise some modern filmmaking techniques such as blue screen for the compositing, but they still rendered the final product to make it look like a project that came straight out of the 1930s. In this new interpretation, the crustacean spider from the original has been made more crab-like to look more in line with the original conceptual design. As well, unlike the original, the main spider in this recreation is hairless. Amusingly, in the behind the scenes, you can see Peter Jackson looking over the spider from Black Scorpion, and the face does resemble it somewhat in the recreation, so I suppose now we can say that that spider was always in the original. Sad it may be that we have no production image of the original tentacle creature, we can at least now see some version of it in the Peter Jackson recreation. Amusingly, animator Graham plays the sailor that gets devoured by this ghastly beast, and he got the luxury of animating himself being devoured. It's quite poetic, isn't it? And the team included this nice little continuity lead-in where we see the vine creature crawling up, fitting in line with the already existing footage of the final film. The recreation and the behind the scenes were all included as a bonus feature on the 2-disc DVD set of King Kong in 2005. Given that sadly we no longer have the luxury to speak to O'Brien or any of the animators of the original, it's quite nice that we've got this in-depth mini documentary about the making of the recreation. It acts as a substitute of learning about the original techniques. And over the years we've had even more interpretations from other filmmakers of the spider sequence. And for me, that's quite fun, almost like retelling an old fairy tale story, adding new twists and turns to it. During my time researching, I couldn't help but notice that while it seems like that every single Kong model does still exist in some capacity today, the only ones that I couldn't find a modern picture or reference to were 4 out of the 5 pit creatures. While it's most certain that the Spider Pit sequence never made it any further than the pre-production stage, so there's no footage to find, but since the models were at the very least made, I'd like to think that the original stop-motion puppets of the creepy crawlies are still roaming about somewhere out there. Let's hope that one day they can be retrieved and can be placed somewhere where they can be safely admired by the public, offering us for the first time in well over 90 years, a clear look at the stars of Hollywood's most famous and long-lost deleted scene that doesn't exist.